Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Sheviis chapter 9, Halacha 6. If you're following along in the art scroll, we're on 7782. It's a really interesting Mishnah and Gemara to finish up chapter 9. So in the Mishnah, we're going to talk about the use of Sheviis produce after Beur comes. And we're going to be getting into some of the issues that came up in Masechet Peah. One of the questions that comes up is what is going to be the status of rich people with regards to Hefker. This is a debate between Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai. And the question is are rich people going to be subject to restrictions on Sheviis? Now, we're going to learn something very interesting about the dikduk and the writing of the Torah itself, and it's going to help us to answer that. And without this Torah verse, we wouldn't be able to understand it just from Gezer Shavas or from any other tool for analysis. We actually need some help from the Torah in order to understand what to do from it. Also, we're going to be getting into another topic that came up in Peah and what's going to be coming with how we're going to be storing it and how we're going to be distributing it. And this came up with Peah when you have a farm that's inundated with water, and how is it where you're supposed to treat the Peah? And the answer is over there. The farmer is supposed to collect it and leave it there and store it for the poor people. We're going to get something very similar over here. And we're also going to be getting another case that comes up in terms of inheritance. What happens if somebody inherits a field, and it happened to be that on the field there was, in this case, Sheviis growing on the field. What do you do with it? This person didn't willingly collect it. He just got it as an inheritance. And the same case kind of comes up in Peah, where somebody inherits a field, and then how is the Peah going to be handled? So the Mishnah starts off and it says if one has Sheviis produce at the time for Beur and it arrives, one distributes them as food for 3 meals to each and every member of his household and performs Beur on the remainder. Notice here, this is talking about the day that Beur comes. Beur came that day. And this is a little bit different from what you would expect. So as soon as this deadline comes, and this is talking about the type of Sheviis produce that is subject to Beur, you're required to remove it from the house. But what this Mishnah is trying to teach is that during the day before you do it, you're still allowed to distribute as much as 3 meals of each of these types of produce to the members of the household and to neighbors and friends. And then whatever is going to be left over, that's going to be subject to Beur, where you're going to take it out and you're going to declare it ownerless. By the way, the owner, when they proclaim that, this comes from the Tosefta in 8.4, here's what they're going to say. They're going to say, my brother in the house of Israel, whoever has need to take, let him take. So the idea here is, though, before you go and you do that, you're going to have these 3 meals that are going to be distributed to each member of your household, and these meals are not subject to Beur. This is new. We didn't know this before. So we always knew, okay, Beur comes, you put it out. But on the day it comes, what do you do with it? That is a chiddush. This is totally new information that we didn't get yet. And this is saying that you can take the Beur produce and still use it, but sometime during the day, after these 3 meals are done, it has to be left out. Now, the Chazan Ish is suggesting about this in his commentary in 11.6, on his commentary in the Biur, is suggesting that all distributions must end before sundown on the day of Beur, and that which is left over after sundown is going to be subject to Beur. And he's suggesting that further that these 3 meals do not require the person to consume the entire amount within the 3 meals, nor does it limit the meals to a particular size. Rather, all that's required is for the amount that one could possibly consume at 3 meals, no matter how large, and the recipient is then permitted to take as many meals of that as he desires. So he has to set aside, according to the Chazan Ish, 3 meals. They could be very large meals, and he could use that. And then after the amount that's separated from outside of these 3 meals, 3 meals are put aside. From outside of the 3 meals, at sunset, that's what you're putting out, and whatever remained from these 3 meals are not going to be subject to Beur. This is the insight by the Chazan Ish. So we're going to continue on the Mishnah, and the Mishnah is now going to talk about this dispute concerning the use of produce after Biur. And the Mishnah says that the poor may eat Sheviis produce after Beur, but not the rich. Again, this is going to be a view that's going to be coming up from a debate between Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai. And actually, these are the words of Rabbi Yehuda, says the Mishnah, but Rabbi Yossi says both the poor and the rich may eat Sheviis after Beur. So this came up before. What is going to be the status of hefker? Is it going to be where you can leave, as it's talking about in Peah, where you can leave out hefker and just say, this is only for poor people, as Bet Shammai recommends as possible? Or when you leave it out as hefker, is it available to all people, including the rich? And that is the formulation of Hillel. So the Mishnah is basically saying that the Sheviis produce does not become prohibited with Beur. Rather, once Beur is accomplished, one is free to acquire the Sheviis produce and bring it into his house. And Rabbi Yehuda is limiting this permit just to the poor people. Rabbi Yossi is extending it to all Jews, whether rich or poor. And each is going to basically bring his point of view from Scripture, which we're going to be getting into. So, some of the Rishonim are saying that the Beur consists of declaring the produce ownerless, and then once this is done, the owner or anyone else can go acquire the produce and bring it into the house. But there are other Rishonim who are saying that Beur requires the destruction of the produce, which becomes prohibited for benefit with the arrival of the Beur deadline. This is coming from competing sugyas. Actually, we had a sugya a sugya like this that came up also in chapter 9. Rabbi Eliezer's household would leave out wine and distribute it to neighbors, and he basically wouldn't come back and recollect it. So the idea is that, according to that competing opinion, that it really does need to be destroyed. It needs to be in a way where you're not getting benefit of it again. And that's a little bit different than hefker. Normal hefker, you can go back and recollect. And this competing idea is that maybe it's a little bit different than regular hefker because it also has the tag on it, this like other condition that it has to be destroyed. And so that's a nuance. And by the way, this debate carries into Rishonim, and the Rambam, by the way, is going to be ruling where he's going to be saying that according to Rabbi Yossi, eating Sheviis produce after Beur is prohibited, and the Rambam is basically going to be saying about Rabbi Yossi and his point of view, because he has a little bit different reading of Rabbi Yossi. He's going to be saying that both rich and poor are forbidden to eat Sheviis produce after Beur, and the Rambam is going to be looking at Rabbi Yossi in accordance with the general rule that grants authority to Rabbi Yossi over Rabbi Yehuda in looking at this, and then according to Rabbi Yossi, the eating of Sheviis produce after Beur is going to be prohibited. And this, by the way, there's a Tosefta that doesn't go that way. There's a Tosefta in 8.4, which is very clear, and it says that when the Biur time arrives, one takes the produce to the entrance of the home, proclaims it ownerless, after which he may bring it back into his home and continue eating it until it's used up. So there are Toseftas that support that it is available to reclaim, and there are also ones that claim that that it's not available, and that it has to be put out to be destroyed, and then Rishonim carry that out, and it's unclear which is, I mean, it's, today you can go back and reclaim it, but part of that might be because part of this might be d'Rabbanan, and the question that doesn't sound so crazy now is when Rabbi Eliezer is basically implying that, no, you have to put it out to be destroyed, and here I'm just going to distribute it out to neighbors, and I'm not going to come back and recollect this valuable wine. And that might be at a time, where it's actually d'oraita. And so when it's a d'oraita case, that leniency might not be there. So when you're looking at some of these cases, what you have to keep in mind is that it might be in a time frame that it's going to be d'Rabbanan. That's actually going to be the last sugya that's coming up here. And, in a case where things do go back to being d'oraita, is that going to be a case where, we're going to have to go back and redo Beur, and this idea of hefker for a Beur, where you can't go back and reclaim it, and you lose that leniency because there is an inyan to go and destroy it. So that, by the way, is going to be coming up pretty quickly. This all happens when the majority of Jews are living in Eretz Yisrael, and that might be coming sooner than we think. So the Mishnah is now going to talk about another dispute on the use of Sheviis produce, and if someone had Sheviis produce that fell to him as an inheritance or was given to him as a gift, Rabbi Eliezer says it should be given to those who will eat it, but the sages say the sinner should not profit. Rather, the produce should be sold to those who will eat it, and its purchase money should be distributed among all people. So Rabbi Eliezer and the sages, they have a disagreement as to whether this produce that you got as an inheritance or a gift should simply be given to those who will eat it, or whether they have to pay for it. The reasoning behind the ruling is whether the Mishnah is speaking of permitted Sheviis produce or forbidden Sheviis produce. Now, if you have forbidden Sheviis produce, how can you go sell it? That's going to be part of the question. The teaching concerning the applicability of challah and Sheviis produce comes up, and the Mishnah finishes up and says, if one eats from a dough of Sheviis produce before challah has been separated from it, he is liable to death at the hands of heaven. Now, we know that challah is taken out from a batch of dough given to a kohen, and challah is a form of truma. We know that because there's a connection with it in the Torah, and like eating food that's tevel without separation of truma, it's going to be forbidden. Even a kohen can't eat it. So somebody who goes and partakes of a dough from which the challah has not yet been separated is going to be like someone who eats tevel, and they're going to be liable to the death penalty and liable to the penalty of death at the hands of heaven. So that's a very serious issue. Now, there's a debate in a Gemara and the Bavli. Is it a case where death at the hands of heaven is actually going to be more serious than karet or less serious than karet? And there's some debate on that. But there is an opinion that it's actually more serious than karet. Now, in the general rule for challah, when you're dealing with the case of Sheviis, there could be a doubt as to whether you would be required to take out challah, because Sheviis produce can be regarded as ownerless by the Torah. Now we're dealing with Beur and things that are things that are left outside as hefker. Now let's say somebody had a field, and this field was an inheritance, and on this field is going to be Sheviis produce. It's going to be wheat. Now somebody comes and collects this ownerless wheat. Question is, are you going to go and separate challah? So one could assume that, look, there is an exemption for ownerless product, like, for say, taking out, truma meiser from peah, right? You don't have to separate truma and meiser, and also you don't have to separate challah from peah. But in the case of Sheviis, what's going to be the issue? And the question is, is it going to be where there's going to be a requirement? So this is saying that if you eat from a dough of Sheviis before challah has been separated from it, you're liable to the death of hands. It's like basically like eating tevel. He's liable to death at the hands of heaven. So that's also a big chiddush that we wouldn't have known. We could have, if the Mishnah didn't say this, you could have made an argument that, over here, peah is not going to be subject to truma and meiser, and you also don't have to separate out challah from it, and that's ownerless. This is ownerless. So here let's in terms of peah, definitely leket and shkichucha would not have that. Peah is really left for the poor. It's not quite ownerless. But in terms of leket and shkichucha, that is ownerless. So the Gemara is going to start off, and Rabbi Yehuda rules in the Mishnah that only the poor may eat Sheviis produce after Biur, but not the rich. And we're getting into that ruling. What is Rabbi Yehuda's ruling? And he says it from the following verse. This, by the way, is in Exodus 23:11. And it says, "And the poor of your nation shall eat." This is talking about Sheviis produce. "And the remainder, the beast of the field shall eat." And basically, this verse is implying, according to Rabbi Yehuda, that only the poor can eat, but not the rich. And this, by the way, would be a chiddush, because normal, ownerless produce can be available for rich or poor to take. So without a specific verse, you wouldn't know this. And so this is the root of Rabbi Yehuda's ruling that, the Torah is specifically saying this is just for poor people. And you wouldn't be able to figure that out with just logic or without this explanation in the oral law. So Rabbi Yossi is going to be ruling, as we saw in the Mishnah, that both rich and poor can eat Sheviis produce after Beur. And the Gemara is going to say, what is Rabbi Yossi's reasoning? And he's actually going to explain this same verse differently. He's going to be saying, "And the poor of your nation shall eat, and the remainder shall eat as well." And so in a simple reading of the verse, it's basically saying, and the remainder, and basically he's using this word remainder as referring back to the previous phrase, which says, "And of the poor of your nation shall eat." So this is basically a reading where he's saying that the verse is teaching that both the poor and the remainder of the people, who are the remainder of the people? That's going to be the rich people, and that they can eat Sheviis produce after Beur. So what this verse is saying, and you wouldn't know this ordinarily, this is saying that the poor people are going to go eat first, and after they eat, that it'll be available to the rich people. And you wouldn't know that by the normal rules of ownerless produce, and you wouldn't know this without a specific statement in the Torah that you're going to give priority to the poor people to be able to collect it first, and then the rich people after. And that's really a big chiddush. You wouldn't know this is the way it's supposed to be done any other way. The Gemara now is going to talk about a related brisa, and they taught in a brisa. Rabbi Shimon says the rich may eat from the communal storehouse after Biur. And this, by the way, is going to be really very similar to Rabbi Yossi's opinion. And basically what this is saying is this is a reading where I'm reading this as an and, right? Rabbi Shimon is not saying something contradictory to Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Shimon is basically reinforcing that there's an order, and that first it's going to be made available to the poor and then the rich. And we're seeing here that this new thing that the Bet Din is supposed to be collecting the Sheviis produce and putting it into a communal warehouse. And every Friday they're going to distribute the poor the food according to the poor or the people of the needs. And basically Rabbi Shimon is holding, and this is what is new about this, that although rich are generally forbidden to eat Sheviis produce after Beur, they're permitted to eat the produce gathered in the communal storehouse. Now, one of the things that you'd say, well, why is it that the rich would be able to eat this at all? And, you have a thing. You don't want any wasting. You're not allowed to waste Sheviis produce, so perhaps you have leftovers. So the Torah explicitly says, and the poor of the nation you shall eat. And the remainder, this is talking about the remainder, which is talking about of your people. That's going to be the rich being able to eat the leftovers. So again, this would be consistent where you have an order, and then you have it where you're doing it in a way where there's no wasting. And that's part of the Hiddush of Rabbi Shimon's point. I think also part of what's novel about all of this is that if you just looked at the rules of Hefker, you'd say, well, rich people can go and collect the Beur and go and keep it. And then you would say, no problem. But that's actually not what's being written here. Actually, you're supposed to be leaving it out for the poor, and then whatever's left over, then it's supposed to be taken. Now, I've seen in the old city, I've seen rich people take out wine of Beur and go and put it out as ownerless and then go back and recollect it. And so all of this makes me wonder, well, wait a second. They own houses in the old city. They're rich. And certainly they don't have any status of poverty. So how could it be that they can go and recollect it? Because isn't it where it's supposed to be left out for the poor? Because again, you have this verse, and the poor of your nation shall eat. And so it's not a case of normal hefker. I think that's part of the chiddush here. Normal hefker, you can go collect it, no problem. This is not exactly normal hefker. There's a condition left on it. And that's what's novel about it. And this condition, by the way, is actually put on by the Torah itself. That's what's novel. Now, the Gemara is going to ask, what is Rabbi Shimon's ruling and reasoning here? And he explains the verse in the following way. He says, and the poor of your nation shall eat, they alone shall eat, until the remainder is brought to the communal storehouses. At that point, all the rich may eat. So Rabbi Shimon is basically agreeing with Rabbi Yehuda in some way that the verse where it says, and the poor of your nation shall eat, does exclude the rich. But he also agrees with Rabbi Yossi, where he's saying, look, this phrase of this phrase where it's talking about remainder, this is going to be extra. And this extra phrase remainder in there, this is going to be teaching like what Rabbi Yossi says, in agreement with Rabbi Yossi, that it does have meaning, and it's talking about the rich people. It says specifically the poor, and then after the poor, the remainder is going to be the rich. In other words, the Torah is putting on an order. And basically, because it's putting on an order, basically it's going to be saying that this remainder is going to be from the Bet Din storehouse of whatever's left over. Because again, you don't want wastage. Now, all of the produce in the storehouse is going to be permitted even to the rich. But part of what I think Rabbi Shimon is talking about here, where it says, and the poor of your nation shall eat, and they alone shall eat as long as there is a remainder in the field. This verse is teaching that the poor has exclusive access only to that which remains in the field, and the produce in the storehouse, however, is going to be available for the rich as well. Now, Rabbi Kanievsky explains that the reason the rich can eat from the storehouse is that the community-owned product is not subject to Beur. And since the prohibition on the rich applies only to produce after Beur, any produce donated to the community storehouse is permitted to them. But I think, again, it's distributed to the poor first. So that's a big hiddush, and I think that some of these people that are rich and putting out Beur and then going back and recollecting their Sheviis wine probably are not right on the halacha on that, because I think they're too rich, and I think that it's not normal hefker. It's supposed to be left out, for the poor, and then if it were donated to a storehouse, the poor would be able to collect it first, and then the rich, and I think they're disqualified from collecting it. So the Mishnah stated, if one has Sheviis produce that fell to him as an inheritance or that was given to him as a gift, the Gemara is going to say a dispute between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish regarding the circumstances of this case, and it's going to start with the view of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says, the Mishnah is stated with regard to produce that is the product of a transgression. In other words, that the owner neglected to perform Beur on it. Now, the Rosh, in talking about the Mishnah, is going to be explaining about it that he barred the poor from entering the field to take the Sheviis produce or deliberately remove the produce to a place outside of Eretz Yisrael. That way, people could do it. In other words, this is not just a normal inheritance where you got a field and there happened to be some grain growing there. Basically, this is part of the tradition here is it's trying to explain, no, let me explain to you what this mission is really talking about. This is talking about where somehow there was really a protected field, and that's really what's being inherited. There's something off about this Sheviis produce. Now, in a normal case, okay, guy dies, and then there's wheat growing there. The guy inherits the field, and the wheat is there. He has to still leave the wheat to be collected, by the poor people, right? It's not his wheat. But what's interesting about this is talking about where there was a transgression. It was given to him as a gift, or this Sheviis produce fell to him as a gift, and it was done where the father or whoever was doing this was somehow cheating. And so Rabbi Lazer, when he comes and makes this ruling about this, he's saying that nevertheless, with this product that was cheated with, it may be given to those who will eat it, meaning that the recipients are permitted to consume the produce. So according to Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish's interpretation, the exchange in the Mishnah should be looked at like this, okay? So Rabbi Lazer's ruling that, if after the Beur deadline, the person inherits the Sheviis produce and it had not undergone Beur at the deadline, somehow there was something dishonest about this, or he received this product as a gift and he got it after the Beur deadline, he is permitted to partake of it as he normally would after Beur. And although one who gives a gift sinned in the performance where he didn't actually perform Beur, we're not going to penalize the recipient on his account. That's basically, one of the nuances here. So, okay, this guy sinned. He didn't put the stuff out for Beur, and then he's basically claiming like he still owns this wheat, and he doesn't own it. It's hefker. And then he leaves it to someone else. The question is, as Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish is reading this, and as Rabbi Eliezer is reading this, do we penalize the person who inherited it? The sages are not going to agree. They're going to say that the following. This is how they're going to read it. They're going to say that it's important to penalize the person who neglected to perform Biur. In other words, the person who died and, before. And the reason is to ensure that the sinner will not profit. And what they're doing is they're creating a decree that's going to require the recipients to pay for it. So that, if the sinner were going to try to pass this off as a gift or inheritance, basically what they're trying to do is they're trying to subvert that intention. And the rabbis are going to prevent the sinner from profiting. And basically what they're going to do is they're going to create a charge where the person who inherits it has to pay because he's getting it. That's part of it, right? So it's not a free gift. What they're saying is no, we're going to penalize that person who collects it, and he has to pay for this Beur. He has to pay for this product. And that way there's no incentive to cheat with it. In other words, the original person should just go and put the product out as Beur and move on, because if he puts it out as an inheritance and he cheats with it and he fails to perform the laws of Sheviis, the sages are going to come to the person who gets it as an inheritance with a bill and say, oh, you owe this amount of money. So then basically it's like he bought the Sheviis produce, and because he basically bought the produce, that's the way to rectify it. So no matter what happens, they're causing it to be rectified. There's no way to cheat with it. Very, very clever. The Gemara is going to question this interpretation, and they taught in a Baraisa that if one finds the produce that is the product of a transgression, he is forbidden to touch it. In other words, it has to be destroyed. So how does the Mishnah here rule that such product can be eaten? So the Baraisa is teaching that once the Beur time arrives, Sheviis produce that does not undergo Beur is forbidden for consumption. That, by the way, is by rabbinic decree, and it has to be destroyed. So the question that this is asking is, how is it that Rabbi Eliezer is ruling that the produce is going to be allowed for consumption? In other words, how does Rabbi Eliezer, sometimes this is what the Gemara wants to understand, what is the position of Rabbi Eliezer? We know what the position of sages is, that's fine. But we all want to understand, what is Rabbi Eliezer saying about this? Because he's a master. We want to understand the minority opinion here. So the Gemara is going to explain and say like this: a found object is different than one that fell to a person against his will. So in the former case, the rabbis decree that it be destroyed. In the later case, they allowed it to be used. And basically what this is saying, with the help of Rabbi Kanievsky's explanation, is that in the case of found Sheviis produce, where the finder chooses to acquire, the rabbis are enforcing their decree to prohibit the produce that did not undergo Beur. And in the case of inherited produce, where the person acquires it automatically against his will, the rabbis waive their decree. So one could go and ask a good question, and actually Rosh Cirilio brings up the same question. Rabbi Eliezer's ruling is stated with regards to produce received as a gift, and that certainly is not acquired against somebody's will. Okay, I can understand the inheritance is against the will, but what about the gift? Because you could choose to decline the gift. So the rabbis waive that decree for the produce as well, and the Meleches Shlomo explains about this that the decree applies only where the person expended some effort in acquiring the produce, whereas it came from his own accord. The decree can be waived. So I want to look at the Chazan Ish, and he's going to be explaining about it like this: that if it is clear that one is permitted to partake of the produce after the time of Beur, as long as one did not transgress it by neglecting to perform Beur. And this, by the way, would seem to contradict the view that we were talking about before with the Rambam, with Rabbi Yossi's opinion. So the Rabbi Yochanan now is going to get into a different interpretation of this Gemara. Rabbi Yochanan says about this, to explain this Mishnah, that the Mishnah is stated with regard to the permitted Sheviis produce before the time of Biur, and it is not talking about the produce upon which the owner neglected to perform Beur. So that is also a big chiddush. Basically, Rabbi Yochanan does not accept the Gemara's differentiation between the produce that one found and produce that one received as an inheritance or a gift. And he's holding that in both cases, the Sheviis produce whose owner neglected to perform the Beur is going to be disallowed. It's prohibited. And therefore, the Mishnah is talking about permitted Sheviis produce. In other words, he's saying that it's still a time where it's permitted. It's not a time where it's prohibited. And the prohibited Sheviis produce is already not allowed. So he's basically going to be holding that this debate between Rabbi Eliezer and the sages is going to be at a time where this Sheviis produce is not disallowed yet. So the Gemara is going to question this. And, what is it questioning? In other words, it's saying that it's not discussing produce upon which the owner neglected to perform Biur. And the Gemara says, in this case, where we're talking about this permitted produce, it would be, in this case, it would be given, would the Mishnah have taught Rabbi Eliezer says it should be given to those who will eat it? And that's a big question. In other words, if it is permitted produce, then the owner should not be required to distribute to others. So, according to how Rabbi Yochanan's understanding this Mishnah, when Rabbi Eliezer comes along and says it should be given to those who will eat it, it means that the recipient of the inheritance or gift is not permitted to eat it himself, and he has to share it with others, and keeping back only a small part for himself. And the Gemara is going to wonder why, if the produce is permitted, the recipient must relinquish it to others. So the Gemara is going to explain why this is required of the owner. And it was stated by Rabbi Eliezer, one who is a disciple of Bet Shammai, his ruling reflects Bet Shammai's view elsewhere. For we learned in a Mishnah, one may not eat Sheviis produce from another's field with an expression of gratitude from the owner. So this comes up earlier in this Masechet, where are you allowed to go onto this other person's field? The person owns the field, but the produce does not belong to the owner. This produce is ownerless. And what happens if you go and you thank the owner of the field? Oh, thank you so much for letting me get your produce. So this, by the way, is going to be, is this going to be allowed or not allowed? And Bet Hillel says it's not allowed. So as per the ruling of Bet Shammai, this basically, we know that Rabbi Eliezer is a student of Bet Shammai. And, based on this ruling, Rabbi Eliezer is forbidding a person the exclusive use of Sheviis produce received as an inheritance or gift, because that is inevitably going to cause him to feel gratitude to his benefactor. So, therefore, Rabbi Eliezer is going to rule that he has to share this produce with others. I actually got this wrong. So, in the case of Bet Shammai over there, Bet Shammai is actually saying, no, you're not allowed to have any benefit of gratitude at all. Okay, you're not allowed to say thank you. Bet Hillel says, sure, you're allowed to say thank you because it's hefker. It's not yours, so you're not saying anything. You didn't say anything. It doesn't mean anything. So over here, the ruling of Rabbi Eliezer, as explained by Rabbi Yochanan, is basically saying it follows the position of Bet Shammai, because Bet Shammai says you're not allowed to say thanks. And if you left it over as a gift, this person would feel thanks. And if he's going to feel thanks, it's not allowed. And that's why Rabbi Eliezer is saying, no, you have to share it with everyone else, because you're not allowed to have this feeling and sensation of gratitude. That's going to be a problem. Now, the Gemara is going to challenge this, and the Gemara says, would the rabbis and the sages have asked regarding this ruling that the sinner should not profit? So that's a big question, and the question is basically like this. basically here's what the sages are saying. They're saying that, the rabbis are saying that one is permitted to express gratitude for Sheviis produce. This is a position of Bet Hillel because you're not saying anything. And Bet Shammai, of course, says no, you can't even do gratitude. It's hefker. So you can't do gratitude because it's not his, so you're not allowed to do that because it's a condition. In other words, he's going to feel good about it, and it really has to be true hefker. And so, if you're saying thank you, it's like he owns it in some way, and it's not really true hefker. That's the idea of Bet Shammai. Bet Hillel is basically saying no. He can feel gratitude or whatever. It's really not his, and so you can say whatever you want. It doesn't matter because it's not his. So the idea again comes into potentiality versus actuality, and this is always going to be the big debate between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel. And in Bet Hillel's case here, in actuality, it's hefker. You can say whatever you want. It doesn't matter. So the question here is that, doesn't it look like that, the people who are going to be getting this, isn't it going to look like it's going to be basically like the product of a sin? The Gemara is going to answer this question. And the Gemara says that the sages responded to Rabbi Eliezer not according to their view, but actually according to his own view. And they said as follows: according to the view you are expressing that gratitude for Sheviis produce is forbidden and not allowed, should the fruits be given to those who will eat them? So the question is, the recipient with who he's sharing the produce, shouldn't it be that that's also going to be disallowed because that person still might feel gratitude? And the Gemara says that in that case too, this recipient is also going to feel grateful to the benefactor, and the sinner should not be allowed to profit from that sin. So in other words, the Gemara is asking and saying, look, but you're giving it to somebody, and that person's still going to feel some sort of gratitude. Isn't that still a sin? And that person also benefited. Fine, it's not as big a sin as giving it out to another person, but you've given it out to a friend, and that friend will feel gratitude. So the Gemara cites a ruling concerning the sale of Sheviis produce that was kept without Beur. By the way, very clever of the sages to say it that way, to diffuse Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. And basically that's why the sages are ruling the way that the sages are ruling, and not by Rabbi Eliezer, because they're saying that even the sages are coming along and saying, Mr. Rabbi Eliezer, even according to your own formulation where you're giving it to friends, those friends, according to your own formulation, are still going to feel gratitude, and that itself is a sin. And then they're coming along and saying, no, that's why it has to be the way that we're doing it, where that there's going to be a payment. So the Gemara cites a ruling concerning the sale of Sheviis produce that's kept without Beur. And Rabbi Bivi says that Rabbi Yosei ruled regarding these artichokes that are kept without Beur and then sold, and that their purchase money should be cast into the Dead Sea, and the use of this money now is going to be prohibited. So this ruling over here is dealing with someone who neglected to perform Beur with his Sheviis produce, and then he sold that produce, and ordinarily this produce has to be destroyed. But over here you got these coins, and basically what this is saying in Rabbi Yosei's ruling, that the owner has to destroy the money he received for it instead. That's what this is saying. So the Gemara is going to give an exchange regarding the removal of Sheviis produce from Eretz Yisrael. So that's left standing. In other words, they've come along and they've agreed that, yeah, that money you have to throw it to the Dead Sea. You've taken this, you've done a transaction with this product where it was kept without Beur, and you didn't put it out for Beur, and it was, you've kept it after the Beur deadline, and then you did business with it, and then you sold it. What do you do with it? Well, that money that you got, you have to throw it in the Dead Sea. And that looks like a universal opinion. Everybody is going to be agreeing with that. But the Gemara now is going to move on to a nuanced case that is sort of similar, but is new. And we're going to have a question from two very, very important people. So Rabbi Manna asks Rabbi Hiskia. This is going to be the Rabbi Hiskia who is the founder of the Academy of Sipori and one of four people in human history, according to the Gemara in Yerushalmi Sachim, who gives up power willingly to his successor. And who is his successor? Rabbi Manna, who is the next Rosh Yeshiva of the Academy of Sipori. So the Gemara is going to ask a very deep question. It says, what is the law with regard to transporting unripe Sheviis dates from Eretz Yisrael to Ashkelon? And he said to him, it is forbidden. Now, these are unripe Sheviis dates. These are not ripe Sheviis dates. That's what's novel about this. Now, we could also look at the idea that perhaps these are going to be the inferior species of date. That, by the way, comes up in Berachot 57b, as explained by the Rashi. But there's also another way to interpret it, where you're taking Sheviis produce that's not yet ripe, and Rabbi Manna is really asking a question as to whether this is going to be allowed or not, because you could say it's not food yet. The Gemara is stating explicitly that Ashkelon is outside the borders of the land, and that same Gemara is basically going to be teaching that unlike other areas, there's no decree of Tuma on the airspace of Ashkelon. Rabbi Manna is wondering whether the same exclusion would apply with regards to the decree that's going to disallow the removal of Sheviis produce from the land. And Rabbi Hiskia is answering that, in fact, transporting Sheviis produce to Ashkelon is not allowed. And alternatively, the question is whether the prohibition on removing Sheviis produce from the land is going to also deal with unripe dates, which are fit only for animal food. And Rabbi Hiskia is basically going to be ruling that animal food itself is going to be subject to this prohibition. That's going to be the insight of Rabbi Kanievsky to explain that. And the Gemara now is going to give Rabbi Hiskia's reaction to a person who kept his produce without performing Beur. So this is the head of the academy, and this is what happened to a person who did not do Beur. Rabbi Hiskia was standing in the marketplace in Caesarea. This, by the way, there are two Caesareas. This is going to be the Caesarea that's along the sea. This is not the Caesarea in the Golan Heights. Another name for the Caesarea in Golan Heights is Caesarea Philippi. This is Caesarea al-Maritima, which is going to be on the sea. So he saw a person bearing a load of forbidden produce, in other words, produce that had been kept without Beur, and he turned his face so that this person would not see him and request help to load and unload the forbidden produce. So we know from an earlier sugya, if somebody is working with forbidden produce, you're not allowed to help him. And so Rabbi Hiskia is turning away from him so that he's not going to be asked for help. Why? Because he doesn't want to help with a transgression. And the Gemara asks the question, why is all this necessary? And the Gemara explains, in order to make a warning in this place so that others in the city should not learn that if Beur is not performed, the produce is forbidden. So two ways to read this. One is going to be that in this area where we're dealing with produce that came from outside of the land, from inside of the land to outside of the land, because there's another place here in the sugya, in the Maseket, where Caesarea along the sea is going to be outside of Eretz Yisrael. So this is going to be a similar case where somebody transported it from inside of the land to outside of the land, which is going to be not allowed. And not only that, it's going to be a double compound. Also, what happened was this person inside of the land, this produce was supposed to be subject to Beur. It's supposed to be ownerless. And nonetheless, this dishonest merchant was supposed to take it out, and he's going to go do business with it. So he effectively is going and doing three transgressions. One is he's transporting produce from out of the land, from in the land to out of the land. 2 is he didn't separate Beur. And 3 is he's going to do business with Sheviis produce. And then he's going to do a fourth avera, which is he's going to presumably have this money that he's going to get dishonestly that's supposed to be thrown into the Dead Sea. And he's going to do something with that. The Gemara asks, why is this necessary? And the Gemara answers, in order to make a warning in this place so that others in the city would not learn that if Beur is not performed, the produce is forbidden. So the Gemara now is going to relate to what happened after this incident. And the Gemara says, Rabbi Yaakov bar Acha heard of this incident and said, the mother of this one, Rabbi Hiskiah, gave birth to a great son. And this is basically saying that he admired Rabbi Hiskiah for having taken the trouble to educate the people of Caesarea regarding the law of Beur. So that, even in this place where, if produce came from outside of the land, and, maybe these people are not used to dealing with Beur, nonetheless, they purchased a product at the marketplace that is from Eretz Yisrael proper, and, they went ahead and they have it, they're supposed to put Beur, they're supposed to put it out for Beur. So even if they purchased it, and now it's subject to Beur, okay, they weren't supposed to have the produce, but they still have the produce, and they still have to put it out for Beur. The Gemara relates an incident that occurred with a student of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, and Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi would command his disciple like this and say, do not buy vegetables for me during Sheviis except from the garden of Sisera, which was always owned by non-Jews and whose produce is therefore permitted during Sheviis. Okay, Sisera, this is talking about an area around Bet Shean, and this is talking about where they had a non-Jew named Sisera. This is not talking about Sisera the king necessarily. So we know that the original Sisera that was in Scripture was a Canaanite general, and Barak ben Avinoam went and defeated him. And during Sheviis, basically, at this time, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is going to be careful to purchase vegetables, only from this field, either that was owned by this general, and it was going to be in this area around Beit Shean, or it would be that this land was famous for being owned by a guy named Sisera who was not of this general, and he was a non-Jew. And then a third way to look at this is going to be that it's in Bet Shean, which is going to be an area that Rebbe said is not Ole Bavel. Now, there's a disagreement between Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi and Rebbe. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is holding that this Kedusha applies even if it's going to be from Ole Mitzrayim. In other words, this land, came from the people who are from, coming into the land with Joshua and were the Ole Mitzrayim. And basically, he's holding that that this is going to have Kedusha even then. Rebbe is saying, no, it's only going to be in the reconquest with Ezra, and this land is going to be left out of it. And part of why Rebbe declared that Bet Shean was left out was because, and why Ezra left it out, was because they wanted an area where poor people could always get the produce easily. So it would be subject to Sheviis because it's out of the land. And so, the economics would be a little bit different. So, if you had poor people over there and they were growing, they could still use it, and it wouldn't be subject to Sheviis. That's kind of what's going on. So, amazing thing happens. And on one occasion, he who is remembered for good, this is going to be Elijah the prophet. By the way, Elijah the prophet used to come to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi in his dreams. And it says that it rose before the disciple and said to him, go tell your master that this is not really the garden of Caesarea the Ancient. So this is amazing because Eliyahu HaNavi actually didn't come to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. He came to his student, said to him, go and tell your master this is not really the garden of Caesarea the Ancient. Rather, it once belonged to a Jew, and a non-Jew killed him and took it from him. So basically what this is saying is saying that even though the non-Jew is growing there now, and it looks like it's owned by a non-Jew, it was once owned by a Jew, and it's really still Jewish land, and it really still has sanctity. And whether you're going to hold, whether it's going to be Ole Bavel or Ole Mitzrayim, that if you're going to hold by like Ole Mitzrayim, this was owned by a Jew. This is not the Caesarea of the Bible, and this is not land that was never, was always owned by a non-Jew. It was once owned by a Jew. And so he's basically saying, if you're going to hold by, the laws of Ole Mitzrayim, you should know this. Now, that's a big hiddush, because it looks like, hey, wait a second, isn't he basically endorsing this view as opposed to Rebbe? That's a big hiddush. So Eliyahu HaNavi continues and says, but in truth, even the fruits of this field are going to be allowed, since it belongs to a non-Jew at present. And therefore, if you wish to be stringent with yourself, you may do as your fellows do and eat the fruit of the field. And basically, what this is saying is that Eliyahu HaNavi is informing the disciple that the garden of Caesarea is no different than any other non-Jewish owned field, and it once belonged to a Jew, and he's informing him that there was no basis for the stringency, and basically advising him to do as his fellows did and eat the Sheviis produce of any non-Jewish owned field. And alternatively, you could, see it like how the Vilna Goan sees it, and read it like this, where he's saying that even if you wish to be stringent on your own account, you should permit your fellows to partake of the produce of the fields of non-Jews. So another way to read it is also going to be that, Eliyahu HaNavi is basically coming along and saying, no, one way to look at it is also to look at it with regards to Ole Bavel, right? So that if the other people are keeping by the laws of Ole Bavel in this area of Bet Shean, then you should also do it that way too, and treat it that way. In other words, that you should eat this produce and not worry about it, because the people who are treating this land as being not of the conquest of the Ole Bavel are eating it without any restrictions of Sheviis, and you should as well. And you should not take on this condition of the Ole Mitzrayim, and that if they had it once, that it's going to be forbidden. In other words, that if your other people and the other sages are coming along and doing this, there's no reason for you to be stringent as well. The Mishnah stated, if one eats dough from Sheviis produce before challah had been separated from it, and that's a big chiddush. And the Gemara records an incident concerning the separation of challah from Sheviis dough, and the Gemara tells an amazing story that there was a certain man who was suspected of violating Shemitah law, and he said to his wife that after she prepares a dough with the forbidden Sheviis grain, says, remove challah from the dough. And she says to him, this man, meaning the husband, is suspected of violating Sheviis, and now you say remove challah? It's a big question. In other words, why are you showing such concern for the laws of challah and not for the laws of Sheviis? And the husband says back to her, and he says to her, the requirement of challah is biblical, therefore I'm careful to fulfill it. But Sheviis in the present day is an enactment of Rabban Gamliel and his followers, and therefore I do not concern myself with it. In other words, he's saying it's going to be to Rabbanan. Now, That's a strong statement. So the person is of the opinion that the requirement of Beur and the prohibition to eat after the Beur deadline is going to be rabbinic. And another way to look at it is going to be that the entire law of Sheviis nowadays is going to be rabbinic. Now, the Ramban is going to be holding that, this person's statement that Beur is going to be a rabbinic obligation. The Gemara is asserting that this is indeed the fact. Now, the Rosh Cirilio doesn't agree with that, and he's going to say that there are biblical verses that teach the requirement of Beur, and so the question is going to be, this really is sort of a puzzle. It really turns things on its head because, we've been learning all of this, and this guy who is a Sheviis cheater is brought up as an example, and is basically saying that it's d'Rabbanan. Now, we don't really like to learn from cheats, and we don't like to really learn halacha from theft and from people who are breaking d'Rabbanan laws and playing games. So, we should not see this as straightforward. This is a Yerushalmi puzzle, and this should not be taken as sach halacha. This should not be taken as just to read it on his face and say, oh, well, it's d'Rabbanan, therefore I don't need to keep it. You do need to keep it. And if the rabbis are coming along and putting it, even if at the present day it's going to be d'Rabbanan, you still have to keep it. And that, I think, is one of the deeper ideas here. And this echoes one of the ideas that started off in chapter 9 with a statement of Shimon Bar Yochai. Have a great day.